G'day everyone, Ben Kingsley here. Thanks for tuning into this video. It's obviously in regards to the information that I talked about on one of our episodes on the podcast where I was comparing 4% growth and 6% yield and 6% growth versus 4% yield. So to do that, Empower Wealth has an amazing property wealth simulator software that we've developed in-house to help advise our clients. And there's a tremendous amount of moving parts in this particular modelling software, and there's hundreds of thousands of calculations that take place. Now, I don't want to spend too much time sort of articulating those, but as we flow through this information and this modelling, you can see that I've got a lot of areas that I can manipulate and put variables onto and so forth. Now, you can also see down here I've got growth rates for a property, yield rates, rental increases, occupancy rates, management fees, expenditures, etc., right through interest rate calculations and alike. And yes, when you're doing full modelling, depreciation, the whole lot needs to be considered. That's what we call sophisticated modelling. In this particular case, again, I'm going to keep it simple. What we're doing is looking at the relationship between capital growth return and a rental yield return, and if those were switched around. Now, there will be circumstances where some households, because their surpluses may not be great, that they have to look at doing the yield property. In other words, getting higher yield, which means that that property will effectively self-fund itself to be neutrally or potentially positively geared. On the other side of the coin is a capital growth story. And over the long term, if you can get a really strong capital growth, 7, 8, 9% capital growth, they're game-changing numbers, because what actually happens is, and you'll see it, your property will be valued significantly higher in the 10, 15, 20 years into the future. So let's have a look at what happens when I click on this button here, and I'll just explain this table and chart to you. What we're looking at here is the value of property increasing over time, and I haven't given any instructions around the loan, so it's just maintaining that loan. And again, if there was depreciation, if there were higher income rates, if there were fluctuations or adjustments that I made in terms of holding cost, occupancy rates, everything like that will affect the overall net outcome. But again, keeping the example in a very simplified way, you can see here, if all things were equal, interest rates 7.25, we borrowed 106% of the property, you can see this intersection here where the income from the property starts to outstrip the cost associated with that property, and the property turns from negative to positively geared. Now again, I'm not going to get too caught up in that information. All I want to focus on are the four tabs here, as opposed to the negative cash flows and the positive cash flows over time. So here we are looking at a property that when we first buy it is worth 500. If it has 6% growth, that property is going to be valued at 530,000 after the first year, etc., and you can see the rental yield coming through accordingly. In this side of the conversation, we've got 4% growth. So if the property grows at 4%, our property is worth 520 at the end of that first year, based on a lineal assessment. So you can see here, but the rental income is obviously significantly higher. So this property is generating stronger cash flows, again for those people who may need to have that cash flow early on, and this property return over here is significantly higher over time. In fact, if we look at 20 years from now, this property is worth 1.5 million, and if this property only grows at 4%, we can see here that this property is worth just over $1 million. So there's almost a $500,000 variance in regards to your wealth position. Now, that being said, again, I reiterate, every household's different, and that's why you need to study your cash flow situation, not only today, but into the future, where you might be starting a family, where you may need to have the property supporting itself. Because if interest rates go up significantly from their current levels today, the historical lows that we're enjoying right now, you may not be able to afford that property. And if you're like many others who can't afford that property, there's going to be a glut of property that come on the market, and ultimately property may not be a good investment for you if you have to sell at a loss. So you can also see over time here that as the value of the property grows, because the value is growing, there's propensity to charge higher interest on the higher rent on the higher value property. And you can actually start to see just on year 21, the actual year 22, you can just start to see that now the rent that's being generated from that growth property is actually outstripping the rent that's being generated from that higher yielding property. And if you obviously combine the overall two results, in year 25, we can see that's approximately 2.1 million compared to a valuation here of 1.3. You can see the power of growth properties over yield properties. But again, it's still, you're still going to be in a better wealth position by doing something in the property space if you're choosing to chase yielding properties. And again, it comes back to that situation. So when I'm advising clients, I'm absolutely looking at their surplus household cash flows, their equity position, their changes to income, their changes to expenses before I make any recommendations in terms of how I build out a client portfolio, because that's effectively what I'm looking at. And then over time, I can then measure that out and sort of see how that growth chart's going to look over time. And again, there's not a lot of information here because I've kept it very simple. All right, so that's just the lesson here. The lesson here is just focusing in on what your cash flows are and then the differences between different types of returns that you can enjoy over time. I hope you found the video beneficial, and look forward to you continuing to listen to the Property Couch and continuing to build your knowledge in regards to property investment. Thanks for your time, and bye for now.